Hello and welcome to this week's Dev Diary. This week is the final Dev Diary before Paradox's summer break, which is a roughly 1 to 2 month period in which we'll have no Dev Diaries, so take what you can get now because this is it for a bit. So on we go to discuss this week's topic of supply flow and Mulberry Harbours as we prepare for a D-Day invasion. Let's begin. So the Dev Diary begins in its traditionally blue look. I thought we switched over to grey, but we're back to blue again. Don't ask me, it might be a mistake, but never mind. They begin by discussing that yes, there will be a summer break, and they don't expect to be back with new news until August at the earliest, which means we might be a little bit down and out for new content. The Soviet focus tree remains an illusion, a mirage at the end of a long tunnel. So the main topic they address immediately in the opening paragraph is the way trucks influenced supply and dealing with the spike transition, ensuring that you don't overload supply hubs in the old system. They also thought that the way their original new supply map worked looked a little bit too difficult to show exactly how supply was flowing from one place to another, so hopefully the changes they've made from the last we saw of it will be better. So we open up by talking about supply flow. And one of the key changes from last time is that divisions can now take resources and supply from different supply hubs. Adding on to that, we also have this new supply map, which works a little differently than just showing where there is good and bad supply. It has a layered system. So just to break down the map, we can see that the Benelux region, as well as North France and Germany, are very well interconnected with all their railways and high infrastructure, so supply isn't an issue there. As you move through Hungary and into Transylvania, you can see that it's not necessarily red, but it's much darker. So there's less railway, less infrastructure, and the units there are probably only going to get supply from the local supply areas within that region. They're not going to get it from anywhere else anytime soon. So very weak supply. What's most, of course, interesting is in Ukraine, where it's bright red. And that is because, they describe, the railways they are getting as they're moving into Ukraine haven't actually converted to the Germans and the Axis railway yet, so they're not getting supply. With the new DLC and update, pushing forward isn't so much about speed as it is about making sure your supply lines can justify your speed. So the Romanians, with their huge push into Ukraine, yes, they've got land, but there is a cooldown on the amount of time you can capture the railways you've got and use them for your own supply. So it is effectively like Romania's gone in and there is little to no supply in that region. Once that cooldown has expired, the railways get converted for Axis use, the gauges have been changed or whatever, and then the trains can run happily into Ukraine and supply those Romanian units. Additionally, they also mention how much supply you can actually output from your capital. Now this mostly depends on the level of railways that you've got going in and out of your capital, so directly from the main operational base outwards, but also the amount of industrial base you have there. So places that have less factories are less likely to be able to output lots of supply. The next image we get is a great example of seeing how the rails haven't quite connected. Along the white line, heading in and out of Minsk, we can see the rail lines are good. We've even got 25 out of 30 supply. But as we move east, there's a big red X icon. There is no trains going this way. The gauges don't match up and supply can't adequately be pushed forward. So, the next part of the Dev Diary talks about what to do when the railways are nowhere to be seen and you're fighting in the open plains of Nowhereville. We have Motorisation. So in the image we can see here, we have a collection of buttons that influence and change how supply works. The one on the far right is a cavalry icon. That horse icon is currently saying that supply is being delivered by horseback to units in the field. But if you want to go with a more motorised, a much faster and efficient system, you can toggle it to trucks. So in the case that you're pushing into the Soviets far faster than you can actually convert the railway lines behind you to push supply forwards, this would be a great time to stick the truck supply on. Although it does warn you that using trucks will actually cost motorised from your supply. In addition, supply trucks also have a prioritisation level. So similar to reinforcement or division training, if you feel like those trucks are much more needed to supply units, which they probably are, especially if you're pushing into Russia, then you can prioritise them with the green light and away the supply flows. To briefly go over what the other buttons do on that supply hub, beyond just the horse, the white star gives you the option to change your supply capital. So I don't think that's the actual capital, that's just the supply capital where the supply will flow out of in the off chance that your capital is surrounded by enemy units. You will only be able to do this if your surrender limit is sufficiently high enough, and it will give you some debuff in terms of supply output because, having to tell everybody where we live now is a bit complicated. The blue flag icon is very interesting. I wonder if it's going to work. So apparently it allows you to have ally control access to the node, telling allies whether or not they can get supply from this region. And apparently it's a great way to flag the AI that you do not want them on this front because they're hogging all your supply. If that blue flag icon works out to actually stop the AI from massively over pushing units into one region, that could be like a significant change to the game, especially on the ally side where I feel like you've got 50 different nations all piling into the Greece peninsula just because you managed to get one naval landing on it. Yes, I'll be very interested in that. The little railway junction immediately sticks you into construction mode, which allows you to build more railways, and the plus arrow allows you to do it right there and then in that one particular area, so pretty straightforward. And finally, the chevron icon on the right allows you to prioritise where the trains are specifically going to ensure that areas that have low supply are at the top of the queue for getting supply. So perhaps all your supply is feeding into the north, and in the south it's low, so you up the chevron in the south, and then the supply flows south as a priority first. Pretty simple stuff. I think the next part of the dev diary is a massive fan favourite, and I've seen this talked about quite a bit. It is the arrival of floating harbours, or inverted commas, Mulberry Harbours, which can now be constructed once they have been researched. So here we can see a production queue producing floating harbours. Similar to how you would produce a boat, they use naval dockyards. You can assign a maximum of 5 dockyards to them, and they require iron. We can also see that this one will be done in the 20th of January 36, which would suggest it's built in 19 days with 1 dockyard, but the dev also says do not look too closely at the numbers, so it's probably going to be increased. No 19-day harbours for us. So the core vision of how these Mulberry floating harbours are supposed to work is they're uniquely supposed to be assigned for your massive D-Day, Battle of Normandy level invasions, not necessarily for island hopping in the Pacific. Naval invasions that use a floating harbour will look something similar to this, with the harbour visibly being seen inside the naval tile next to the tile you've landed on. And so once you have landed with your Mulberry Harbour, we can see that the supply is there, it's visible, 2 out of 20 supply, without having captured a single port. It is of course important to realise that these supply hubs are not permanent. The Mulberry floating harbours will eventually fall. It varies on how long it's going to be because they say it could take weeks or months depending on the strength of the air superiority and other factors. So I could imagine that perhaps if you've lost naval control of the area, then the enemy ships are going to come bombard the port and you've lost the supply. So it's really not just about getting the Mulberry Harbours but also defending them. Regardless of the outcome, it's hard to ignore the fact that this does change the way we have to guard ports now, because before it just felt like you could stick a ton of units on all the ports that you own and pretty much you'd be good to go, because if anyone navally invaded you, you didn't need to stop them, you just needed to make sure they didn't get a port and they die of attrition, and that was kind of the core. All in all, this seems like a massive buff for D-Day. I'm very interested to see the practicality of it when we get to launch. And the final part of this week's dev diary before summer break is the new loading screen for No Step Back. It's a great shot of the Polish cavalry attacking the German infantry at dawn in an unsuspected raid. And to me, it's one of my favourite looking wallpapers. It just feels so evocative of the great final charge that you've got to do. Yeah, I'm a big fan of it. I think it's a great looking picture. For those of you who want to download it, the dev diary is linked in the description and you can scroll down and get it inside the dev diary. There's different aspect ratios, so it's all there for you. With that, I think I'll leave it there. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. It's going to be a while until we do another dev diary. It's going to be a while until we see the Soviets, but good things come to those who wait. So yes, if you've enjoyed, feel free to like, feel free to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.